Members and participants in the People's Global Summit, distinguished delegates, dear friends of the national student unions and of the social stakeholders in education all around the world, welcome to the live panel facilitated by the Global Student Forum in the frame of the summit, co-building a new eco-social world. Don't cut our future for a fair and sustainable and inclusive education. Here is the title of our conversation, inspired by the motto chosen by the students' regional platforms and by the JSF as a campaign for the International Student Day in 2021. I would like to begin by thanking the organizing committee for agreeing to host this panel and this marvelous opportunity. And it is a pleasure to be here today, and I want to thank the International Federation of Social Workers. My name is Ettore Bucci. I am a research and policy advisor in the Secretariat of the Global Student Forum in Brussels, and I will facilitate this panel together with Sofia Alonso Wilson, assistant in charge of the social communication in JSF Secretariat. Sofia will do a constant check of social media and public channels so that questions from the audience can be included in the open dialogue. So feel free also to write down these questions during the debate. First, let me introduce our marvelous speakers who have agreed in joining our conversation. Alan Dixon is a meta-theorist in security and education and an activist for human rights, decolonization, and critic of social violence and neoliberalism. She is a National Education Officer for the New Zealand Union of Students Association, and she is serving as a steering committee member in the Global Student Forum. Since 2017, she has worked with Students Association, NGOs. She has worked also to connect student activism with early career researchers, intergovernmental groups, and NGOs. And she is a PhD candidate in international relations at the Victoria University of Wellington. Hi, Helen. Falit Siria is a university student actively involved in local change-making, policy formulation, political activism, and social service work. He has extensive experience in mobilizing the student community towards progressive and inclusive ideas of gender inclusion, racial justice, environmental conservation. He is India's representative at the G20 Year Forum for the Diversity and Inclusion section, and is the founder of the association Studo Matrix that is joining also the Global Student Forum as associate member. Thank you, Falit, for accepting this contribution. Humza Lutango is responsible for research and advocacy for the Secretariat of the Global Campaign for Education in Johannesburg. Enrolled in a master's degree in governance with a specialization in economics and development, she has experience as a policy developer, researcher, and monitoring and evaluation consultant, being also the author of an interesting publication, Sustainability Assessment of Breaking New Grounds in Human Settlements. And last but not least, Andrei Frank, after a long experience at the Solidar Foundation, is the policy and advocacy coordinator for the Lifelong Learning Platform, the European network of social stakeholders in education. Graduate in politics and philosophy from the University of Sheffield, he will give us an interesting and specific overview of the European case. Welcome to everyone, and thanks for accepting our invitation. But first of all, who we are and why we have chosen this topic. The Global Student Forum was founded 3 years ago by the All Africa Students Union, Commonwealth Students Association, European Students Union, the Organizing Bureau of the European School Student Union, and the Organización Continental Latinoamericana y Caribeña de Estudiantes, along with the New Zealand Union of Students Association, and other national student organizing movements. We are talking about 202 student unions from 122 countries. The numbers and this ramification allow us to say that we recognize the democratic and representative platform of the international school and university student movement, with a number of graduate affairs as well. It is a challenging representativeness that we place at the center of our negotiation with other stakeholders with international institutions. Just to give you an example, the director, Sebastian Berger, met Lardo Garnier, UN Special Advisor for the Transforming Education Pre-Summit held in Paris. And Garnier, in his speech, had the possibility to say that Hi again. Sorry for this. Sorry for this little inconvenience. I was saying that Leonardo Garnier, as UN Special Envoy for Transforming the Education Pre-Summit, said that no human right has ever been gracefully conceded. And in our opinion, it's the same for education. And why? Last but not least, we are interested in talking about financing tools. Through the Global Student Declaration, that was also part of the presentation of the keynote record speech developed by the Global Student Forum, we were interested in highlight some points, starting from the World Higher Education Conference in Barcelona. For preparing this event, we set up an international task force of around 20 student union leaders and activists. Farid was part of this task force, and Ellen also was part of the drafting process of this Global Student Declaration and of this policy brief, with which we decided also to contribute in this opportunity. For this very reason, we cannot forget the harsh impact of the pandemic and the harsh impact of lots of factors that are affecting also students, households, and families, also as highlighted by the Education Finance Watch 2022, produced by the World Bank, the Global Education Monitoring Report, and by the UNESCO Institute for Statistics. We are talking about several factors, several contexts, and we are interested in developing this conversation starting from best practices and effective situation. So let's start. Let's start from Ellen. Ellen, following the purposes of this summit, the Global People Summit, we are debating in the frame of the drafting process of this charter for an eco-social world. The main point to be achieved, fair ecosystem, economic reforms starting from measuring economies by profit to sustainable well-being societies, solidarity, work, and social protection. And according to this overarching principle, and according to your specific experience as student activist in the national and international student movement, which policies, funding policies in particular, should be addressed in order to support these claims? Thank you, Ellen.
Mahinoe Ettore. That means thank you in Te Reo Māori. It's a very big question to give me, so I hope I shall be able to do it some justice. First of all, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa, which is a greeting in Te Reo Māori. I am Ellen, I'm from the Global Student Forum. I'm also from Aotearoa, New Zealand in the Pacific. So coming at you from the Pacific Ocean, well, not quite, slightly off from there. I'm just going to quickly share my screen with you because I have a lovely little presentation which will be quite helpful to see in order to answer Ettore's question. I think when we're looking at significant policies regarding international and national financial policy contexts, we actually have to look a little bit about what that context is embedded in. And this is exactly what the Don't Cut Our Futures campaign that was led by the student movement, the Global Student Forum, and the regional bodies was seeking to focus on. It was seeking to identify the context of financial education policies as sitting largely at the moment within a neoliberal structure that operates on the assumption that the economy is within a free market that can basically govern society. An ideology that all social problems can be solved through, unfortunately, individualistic and competitive models. I really like this quote from Jean-Francois Lyotard, who was a leading postmodernist who had the amazing ability to predict the future, and said, "The question, overt or implied, now asked by the professionalist student, the state, the institutes of higher education, is no longer, is it true when coming to the educational context, but what use is it?" This creates the prospect for a vast market of competence and operation skills, which on first glance appears something that is very useful, and on second glance starts to take us away from the social welfare state and the eco-social values that we need. So we absolutely applaud this particular conference and the creation of this charter within the context of the Don't Cut Our Futures campaign. I think when we are talking about policy, it may be a little bit easier. I'm just going to go to my next slide. Instead of talking about specific policies, Ettore, I think I will talk about policy topics. Because of the context of neoliberalism and the situation and scenario that we are largely sitting in as students, we are well aware that we are having our agency taken from us due to the context of the free market focusing on commercialization of our education experiences. The particular paper that was released by the GSF during this time period and this campaign tried to identify long-term economic planning with meaningful investments in education was necessary. School financing with basic needs for infrastructure, particularly sanitation and hygiene, in addition to eco-sustainable buildings. The issues of the COVID-19 pandemic playing into things, the issues of gender power relationships, and the issues of mental health and physical health issues and students being able to afford that. As a consequence, when we look at some of the trending topics in policy, we can see a little bit of a shift. And I think these are the things that we need to be focusing on in national and international engagement. The first one is focus on domestic funding. This has been one of the very big hot topics at the moment, which if you've been following education, it's been everywhere. Education International reports over the past 40 years, most international meetings and policy documents on education finance have focused on international aid or concessional loans, but these make up only 3% of financing of education. Over 97% of finance comes from domestic sources. And in order for this to be fully identified, it needs to be embedded in domestic policy. So currently, we might want to look at domestic policy and education with a little bit of a critical eye, which is the whole entire point of the Don't Cut Our Futures campaign. EI suggests that embedding this type of policy in a domestic context would require the need for decolonizing and understanding education financing and the north-south transfer of resources that sits within the neoliberal structure. Thankfully, this has already been highlighted to a certain extent by the Paris Declaration and thematic track 5, financing of education, at the UN Pre-Transforming Education Summit. And it has proposed a number of ways that domestic policy can actually aid in the engagement of this space. The Paris Declaration stated, education is an investment that requires sustainable funding. We recognize that domestic resources, particularly through tax revenues, are essential and remain a primary source of funding for education. They also stated more revenues are needed to increase education budgets. In addition to that, measures that strengthen and design equity of the tax system as well through innovation financing measures, including 4 to 6% of GDP, 15 to 20% of public expenditure to education, and for 0.7% of Gini to ODA. The thematic track 5 includes direct statements on how we can actually implement this as a roadmap in domestic policy, including actions on tax, debt servicing, debt financing, climate financing, budget shares, austerity, perceptions, dialogue, and aid. As a consequence, it creates a roadmap on the way that we can move to go beyond the neoliberal structure. But I would also warn a little bit that education as an investment, being the first line of the Paris Declaration, has not fully moved away from the neoliberal structure that is undermining student agency. Education as an investment is a good thing, but as student unions remind, education as a social good is even better because it embeds it in the context of the social environment and the context of the relationships that we share between each other. Our second one that we move to is managing inequity in privatization. Again, we return to our lovely colleagues, Education International, who we love so well, provides another paper looking at how higher education, marketization, privatization, and commercialization is now appearing in multiple forms. This can include contracting out of educational services. Educational services are anything between the ability for a student to get healthcare-based engagement or the ability for them to live on campuses. All of these things are largely provided by third-party providers. It also gives us a little bit of a wake-up call when we look at the recent policy developments and international engagement when it comes to digital and open source information. A lot of this information is based in online environments that are largely involving commercial engagement, third-party providers to get access to democratized research and information in that context. As a consequence, the students as consumers narrative is apparently driving the market because we are pushing up that engagement in that space. As a consequence to that, the new public management system has allowed for the structuring of higher education in the context of being able to have corporates at the top and the power of decision-making at the bottom and school boards as the ones who are largely leading decision-making. The UN Youth GEM Report 2021, Who Chooses, Who Loses, was another thing that we contributed to. In that, it identified that households cover 39% of the total cost of education in low and lower middle income countries. About 1/3 of household primary and secondary education expenditure in low and middle income countries come from households with children in public schools due to hidden costs, whether these are textbooks, whether these are uniforms, all of these things are contributing to the costs of education. In low and lower middle income countries, poor parents employ a variety of strategies to cope with private school expenses, including resorting to unregistered and cheaper schools, which are likely to have poor facilities and offer low qualities of instruction. Household accounts for 30% of total education spending globally and 39% in lower and lower middle income countries. As a consequence, the environment is not equitable. Student debt is considered the new serfdom. Student loan debt in the USA is now equating to $1.7 trillion. That's a lot. It scares me. It keeps me up at night. Student loan debt is now the second highest consumer debt category, second only to mortgage debt and higher than debt for both credit cards and auto loans. Congress has created within the USA some of these implementations and policies that can directly address and deal to some of these areas, such as the CARES Act, putting pauses during the period of the pandemic on key implementation of policies to ensure that loans were temporarily alleviated for those who were in pandemic stress. This in the US happened 3 times. In my country, it happened several times as well. In 2021, 48 of my students' associations in my country called for the government to extend a universal education income in this context in order to be able to try and combat the level of debt. We're now seeing a number of graduate students who are reporting, I think it was 88% in 2017 when my union talked to graduate students who are thinking about not having children due to the fact that their debt is so high, given the fact that incomes are not necessarily rising in accordance with investment. We now have to consider whether or not young people will be able to afford houses, will be able to afford sustainable jobs. Some are even asking whether or not they can afford food. I saw an article the other day that said, does a mother eat or does her children eat so that they can go to school? I think we also need to realize that under managing inequity and privatization, that universities have become the place of soft diplomatic power. I think it was said during the period of the Paris Declaration that never before have heads of states been so focused on engagement as education as in this time period. As a consequence, we are seeing this increase in policy engagement at a domestic level, but a lot of it has been pushed into trade-based policy. Instead of it sitting in the context of educational-based policy or social welfare-based policy, it's been sitting in multilateral trade agreements. Furthermore, lack of actions on levels of education, expenditure classifications, and all these sorts of things has also seen, particularly in my region, an increase in foreign interference in governmental engagement at an educational level, which is a sad reflection on the minimization of academic freedom that is so essential to students. Consequently, we come to my last point, which is the importance of repairing the pipeline. It seems a little bit weird to call it a pipeline because what I'm actually referencing is the importance of aiding teachers and early career researchers to be able to do the work that they wish to do. Education International and Action Aid published in June 2022 that it will require 69 million teachers worldwide to be able to achieve SDG 4 by 2030. In order to be able to do that, we need to partner as students with those who are our educators, dealing with the fact that low pay teacher shortages due to public sector wage bill cuts and freezes have been led by, unfortunately, the IMF and ministries of finance and wider austerity policies. The Public versus Austerity, which was released by EAI, found that in 15 countries alone, such austerity cuts have blocked the recruitment of over 3 million nurses, teachers, and other essential public workers. We need to be able to address that. We need to support our social welfare state. We need to not see it as less. Education is central, as we will come to my last point. Functioning areas of UNESCO, in addition to that, also had issues with not supporting early career researchers. The functional areas proposed that we need to get research to influence policy. The only concern with this is that a lot of early career research is actually suffering from the gig economy. Their work hours are underpaid, they do not have access to union engagement or to general workers' rights. In Australia, systematic wage theft is agreed to have legally happened towards most early career researchers who are struggling to survive on a daily basis. But all of this relates to my last point. The basis of education is democratic thinking. Its whole purpose is democratic citizenship. It prepares you as an individual and as a collective to be able to engage as a democratic citizen in political participation. Therefore, an attack on education in the context of neoliberal policies and austerity is actually to undermine the ability for the individual to engage in general human rights. One of the quotes that I love is from Thoreau, and it's here, who is a big critical education theory activist, who says, "These are rights that should be endemic to any democracy. The right to a free quality education from elementary school right through to higher education, the right to have a decent social wage, the right to a decent job, political rights, the right to vote, they are all part of the social contract from the New Deal onwards that never went far enough." If we really wish to achieve our common agenda, which has been put forward, we need to adhere to the Global Student Forum's financing policy, which proposes, in order to have equal education, we must have, as students, a crucial and irreplaceable role in development and building fairer and equal societies. Public and private investments must be effective and subject to public review. Agents of government ministries and international organisations must be allowed to investigate the final purposes of these investments. Safeguarding of the independence of funding must protect higher education in an area of freedom against retaliation or authoritarianism. And public opinion is essential. In order to do that, student voices need to be included, teacher voices need to be included, early career researchers need to be included. And as a consequence, this is why we're so excited to participate in this type of a conference with this type of a charter, because it is essential to the dignity and human rights of young people and all people around the world in the pursuit of an education that is democratic. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ellen, for your really meaningful contribution, given that you made reference to significant points, not only of the student-led advocacy campaigns all around the world, but for example, to Education International. So starting from teachers' point of view, starting from the early careers point of view, and also having as a clear reference an important point, that is the 2021 UNESCO Global Call for Funding Education, the declaration held and released in Paris in November. So now something more from other points of this relevant debate. I would ask Falit for an overview and analysis on the situation of funding in education in the developing countries. What are the main challenges, and above all, what are the main lessons learned in the post-pandemic context? Falit, the floor is yours.
Thanks a lot, Ettore, for giving me this opportunity to the Global Student Forum and the conference over here. And I feel this is a very relevant question that we have over here in terms of what are the lessons from the post-pandemic world and the situation in the developing countries. Now, when we're generally talking about the education segment, a lot of reports come about and they talk about a lot of different segments. What I feel the first need is to contextualize where we stand right now. In the developing countries, we're working in a colonized education system. Most of the developing countries in the current world have a history of colonization. The education systems are built and modeled across those that existed over a century ago or even prior to that. And the entire education systems are geared not to create entrepreneurs or people with ideas or in a model that basically has a focus on innovation and development, but rather on focusing on rote learning and outdated models. And a lot of these developing countries have not been able to invest in restructuring these education models according to the current needs. So what you see is in the current system, the people that were getting educated in the, say, Ivy Leagues in the United States, Harvard, Yale, or all these institutions, or say in Europe, their education system and what is provided to them is starkly different than what is provided to people in the developing countries in their institutions. Now, what this leads to is a significant distance. Now, so you also know there's a lot of attraction from the developing countries to students moving into the developed country. and having an aspirational value to move to these institutions. And this aspirational value is well founded because these institutions provide a significantly higher level of education. And who is definitely and has a more chance of moving to this institution? That depends on the relative amount of income that they have in their own countries, because the expenses in these institutions are extremely high. You have to spend hundreds of and thousands of dollars, and the living expenses are high. So that further contributes to the division that we have in terms of society, and basically increasing the chasm that is there in terms of the haves and have-nots in the society. As I say, that the neoliberal order that they have, it is purely capitalistic in the sense that the institutions or the private institutions that we have in these countries or the developed world are continuously sucking out capital and talent from the developing world. Now, what we also need to understand here is in the entire context, education is something which is a long-term investment in a country's growth. And when something such as a pandemic hits, what we have seen in the entire developing world is that countries, the first step that they do is reduce their hand or investment in education. Why? Because it's very easy to do that, because you can prioritize your funds towards the more visible aspects, say food or a lot of other aspects which are very, very visible. And education becomes the very easy culprit, which you can take funds back from, and nobody basically raises a voice. And what then is needed is a sustained commitment from these countries and the pressure from the civil society to invest in education. Now, what again, why it's not possible is the lack of unionization in the developing world. Most of the organizations that you have, the unionized system, that's in the developed countries. So this entire system, or the lack of unionization in developing countries, again contributes to a lack of accountability on the part of the government in funding. So what we have are a bunch, in fact, a huge bunch of under-resourced institutions which are present over there, which are part of the public sector, but the public sector isn't exactly efficient. Now, in again this context, what is gradually taking place is privatization of institutions, and the government shifting responsibility to private institutions that are coming up and saying, okay, the capitalist order or the neoliberal order would basically feed the entire needs. As money would feed into these institutions, you would basically have all the resources to provide for the education of the country. But again, now these institutions that are coming up, because of their essentially capitalistic nature, are basically feeding in money, and they have huge income, they have huge fees, which the people from the communities which are deprived and have systematically not been getting resources, they're not able to afford these institutions. So again, these top tier institutions or private institutions that, for example, are coming in the developing world, they lack any kind of significant representation and are out of the reach of maximum population in the developing world. And this is where I feel that these kind of discussions and debates come into play, where it becomes important for us as a civil society to come back and retrospect and introspect the direction in which we are moving ahead. And so I don't exactly have a presentation, but I'll try to contextualize the entire situation and give a few suggestions. Now, when we look at it, we have two different modules or two directions in which solutions can go in terms of funding. One is from the perspective of the government, and the second is from the perspective of the civil society. So when you're talking from the perspective of the government, what is needed is we need to understand there's a need for a significant investment in public institutions. Most of the public institutions, whether it be universities or schools across the developing world, are highly under-resourced, and second, highly unaccountable in terms of the teacher attendance that we have, the kind of resources, the teachers that are provided, the amount of resources in terms of food that is provided, and then the prevalence of child labor and students being involved in their family work, which is very, very big problem in rural areas. And that is something I can tell you is very consistent in majority of the Indian subcontinent, in Southeast Asia, in the African continent. And you find that a lot of students, people prefer to have them work in their farms or in their local enterprises or something like that, because they don't have enough income to sustain. Therein comes the importance of providing quality public institutions, which not only provide free of cost school education and university education, but also provide resources in terms of, say, uniform, of study content, of again, institutions and food, which is a very significant part in these institutions. But what happens is, in times of pandemic, when there are resource caps, these are the very things that are hit. And that is what we need to address over here. Now, in this entire mindset and the situation that we have a bunch of public institutions which are there on the face value, which were created when the entire social contract were negotiated, and the governments have a social responsibility. But because they're relatively under-resourced and the private institutions are doing well, there's an aspirational value and also result that these private institutions do. So students and parents whoever gets resources, try to move in their students from the public institutions to the private ones, which in the end leads to this segregation in the society, where the haves are studying in those private institutions which have the best resources, which have teachers, which are well financed, which are able to get in the best opportunities for students. And we have the public institution where nobody wants to send their kids until and unless they have absolutely no resources to send them to. And the teachers are not regular, which is a very strong reality, I can tell you, from the developing world that we continuously face every day. Now, in this reality, what is happening is the chasm is continuously increasing from the school level itself. Moving forward, what we need to do is also understand there's a very outdated subsidy structure that works. So what the governments in the developing world have done, most of the governments have tried to invest in certain, say, institutions of eminence that they're trying to create. And what they do is subsidize the education for each and every single individual who gets into those institutions. So for example, in India, we have the Indian Institutes of Technologies, or the IITs, IIMs, the National Law Universities. Similarly, we have different top universities that are coming up in Africa or Pakistan and other South Asian nations. Now, what is the problem over here in these institutions is the government tries to cover up the significant lack that it has in public institutions by investing in a select few. So for population of millions of people, you have select few institutions which have, say, 2, 3, 4,000 capacity, and you invest heavily in that. But the investment is not regulated efficiently. So what is done is these institutions take in students who are already performing well, or they bring in the cream of the country. And how is this cream decided? That is decided on the relative amount of advantages these students already have. So who gets into these higher education institutions are the ones who are studying in those private schools that I just told you about, because they had the resources, the opportunities, the CVs, the kind of support structure to go into these coaching institutions that they can take in these entrance examinations. So you have these entirely privileged elite students who have the money according to the capitalist system, who are studying in these private institutions, who take in these examinations and move into these public institutions of these higher institutions of eminence. And what you see is that the education for everybody is highly subsidized over there. So as we told about, for a person for a higher income bracket, the amount of funds that they're basically spending in for their education is 0.5%, 0.1%, or even lower. While a person from poor background, even if they're able to make it and go into these institutions, they have relatively higher amount of their family income that they're spending on education in these institutions. And because, again, the funding that is coming in from the entire student population is less, because you haven't charged the ones that who have money, what it leads to is under-resourcement even in these institutions. So the ones who are even at the cream of the private institutions, they decide to move to the foreign institutions that you have, say Harvard, Yale, or the Ivy Leagues in the United States or Europe, where you get even better resources. And there's a hierarchy of school systems that is being built. So for example, if I take the talk about India, you now have the top rung, which constitutes the IB or the International Baccalaureate Board. Then you have the CBSE, ICSE boards, or the Central Board of Secondary Education. And then you have the state boards. And the students, according to the income category, are now arranged in these institutions. The IB boards are the highest and the most expensive private institutions. Then you have the central boards, which again are private institutions, and a private institution and only the rich can afford. And then you have the state boards, in which a lot of government institutions are based, where the poor decide to send in their students. Now, because these institutions are understaffed, under-resourced, and do not have the modern methodologies or opportunities for students, these students lack any amount of significant social transformation or growth that they're able to do, which is kind of reinforcing the gap that is already there in society. Now, if we move about the entire problem again, is that the bureaucratic structure that is working on education, I'll just wrap it up quickly. So what we need to look in this system, the other problem is that the entire funding infrastructure is being decided by bureaucrats, again, which is a very colonial legacy. There's no scope for students to raise their voice, which leads to the point that in the end, when the students say graduate from these universities and say for go to postgrad or PhD in foreign institutions, the entire funding or the sustainable that they're doing and the donations that they're giving is to these outside and the foreign institutions, which feed on these money, but the domestic institutions are getting no funds. And the entire dependence is on government, which is run by bureaucratic structures which have no student say, and hence we are following age-old colonial methodologies of education. So the role of civil society here comes into play, where we need to build in infrastructure and not infrastructure exactly, but connections between, say, the developing world and the developed world to bring in methodologies which are able to provide better educational systems at lower cost and are able to bring in intervention. So for example, we are currently in collaborating with, say, the Finnish education system or the National Student Organization of Finland to bring in their education system to build the capacity of teachers over in India, do an experiment, and then implement their structures to understand how we can build in better worlds, which is something that can provide resources at a lower cost with lower interventions and with a wider framework of less amount of education. With this, I'll just kind of wrap up. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Khalid. Now, Phumza, the floor is yours, because we are interested in understanding something more about the commitment of the global campaign for education. What do you think should be the priorities for funding in education globally in the post-pandemic era? I would like to understand more, given that, for example, one of your recent campaign is focusing on inclusive planning, sustainable financing, and realized right. So, Phumza, the floor is yours, and for all the speakers, please be careful. The timing is running out.
Thank you, Ettore. Yes, Global Campaign for Education advocates for inclusive and sustainable financing across the Global South mainly. We focus on 4 basically action tracks and certain interventions that are required in terms of policy and financing to ensure that education considers girls, different people from geographical locations and places. But before I give targeted actions that GCE advocates for, I like to basically contextualize the work that GCE focuses on and based on the research that we have done. When we look at many countries, it appears that in adopting excessive budget cuts, it is defined as spending less pre-pandemic. The decade between 2010 to 2019 saw significant budget cuts, levering many governments unable to provide quality services such as education. In the context of about 46 governments, it is projected that we are spending less between 2021 to 2022 in terms as compared to 2018 and 2029 at an average of 2.9% of GDP. In 8 countries, the difference amounts to more than 4.0% of GDP in countries such as Dominica, Fiji, South Sudan, Kitts, Tuvula, and Zambia. Furthermore, in the context of South Africa, COVID-19 has undone the commitments made by governments in higher education to subsidize the missing middle, which are students of teachers, police, and nurses, as well as lower income learners, and committing to the non-financing exclusion. People have been excluded despite the fact that they have reached academic standards. In the work of decolonizing education financing and ensuring accessibility to all higher education learning, this has been undone due to the recommitments and prioritization governments has had to focus on post-COVID-19. When we look at the austerity measures, one of the key issues that have been accelerated during post-COVID-19 is that education by government is not perceived as a sustainable development contributor or even an investment portfolio, but it is rather a consumer consumption. So when it came to the reprioritization of budget financing, education has lagged behind due to this perception. GCE believes that we need to focus on dialogue and campaigning as seeing education as a sustainable contributor to economic growth, and rather than establishing other innovative resource mechanisms to invest in education. The impact of this disinvestment, particularly in education, has led to and affected negatively the quality of education, the lack of infrastructure, and not paying academics sufficiently. To answer your question, Otore, firstly, our overall approach to finance should be within the framework of decolonizing the institutional agenda on education financing, moving beyond the traditional focus on the North to the South transfer of aid to loans, and to look at universal, sustainable, and systematic solutions. We need to stop looking at the global South as just as the people who live these lived experiences, while the North facilitates and owns this narrative when you talk about education financing. In terms of the role between coalitions and civil society with international aid, in countries such as South Sudan or Afghanistan, where the problem lies in the government itself, we need to have programs that rely on civil society to ensure that higher education and education overall reaches the intended participants. We have recommendations in 3 areas: the volume of resources, equity, and efficiency of spending, and the collection of financial data. Because public education, money for education, particularly comes from domestic revenue, we should focus, when we look at innovative resource interventions, in how we establish this domestically. Firstly, GCE recommends that there needs to be action on tax, supporting government to deliver on the IMF's projection that key means of education financing of SDG 4 is for countries to increase tax to GDP ratio. This can be done by emphasizing on progressive taxes by taxing the rich. There is a growing recognition of the need to raise taxes in gender-responsive ways and spending in education. National actions in this area needed to be matched by international actions to agree on the global asset register that reduce illicit financial flows. Secondly, when you talk about progressive tax, we need to start considering carbon tax, particularly in educating women, because carbon tax is linked to corporate tax. This could be part of progressive tax that we could allow for that share to finance education, particularly for women in education. Secondly, we need to look at action on budget share. When governments are still falling short of the allocation of 15 to 20% of national budgets to education, renewed commitment should be sought and progress towards this should be closely looked at. This focus on budget shares sets up in competition with health and other sector. When you think about prioritization of social cluster portfolios, we need to consider the perception and the dialogue of the main contributors of sustainable development. Thirdly, action on debt. Taking bold action on debt crisis and global debt architecture and debt servicing does not prevent countries expanding their spending on education. Mainly, which brings us to here, countries need to move away from austerity policies to a stimulus recovery plan, particularly for education that will inject finance and other domestic revenue to the education sector. To go further than these recommendations, Atora, we also need to look at the 4 S's when it comes to education financing, which is the share of the national budget, the size of the government, the sensitivity of budget allocations, and the scrutiny of education spending. We know that the main people who are affected by the lack of education financing are in the North, and the human rights aspect and lens of how much government are spending on share sensitivity, scrutiny, and size of the budget remains important. We also need to increase this through their domestic spending on education and allocating that spend more equitably and efficiently, while tracking and reporting on the spending in a more systematic way. These are the recommendations that GCE advocates for when it comes to transformative financing. And we also have a campaign that specifically focuses on emergency contexts known as Protect Education Emergencies, that wants to focus on mainly financing education during times of emergencies. We saw in the context of Myanmar, Ukraine, Sudan, Congo, and many others where students have had to find refuge in other neighboring countries in order to access education. Education in Emergencies campaign is linked to Education Cannot Wait, where we want more financing to be in education that focuses on emergencies. In conclusion, the education sector post-COVID-19 recovery needs a stimulus package plan that is contextualized amongst the different geographical realities while considering the different nuances and interventions in education financing. Thank you.
Thank you, Pumza. And this last aspect regarding the recovery and resilience facilities is an interesting angle in order to launch Andrei's contribution. Andrei is a part of the Lifelong Learning platform that, as a network, is interested in education from cradle to grave. And Andrei, what added value does your platform bring in general, and what lessons have been learned from the pandemic, and in specific, basically starting from the specific context of Europe, in which the Next Generation EU program has been paramount in terms of providing new funding tools for EU member states in particular. Andrei, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Ettore, and thank you for having us here for this. I'm just gonna share my screen. Good morning to everyone from Europe here. So basically, hello to everybody else who is in a different time zone. I'll talk about investment in education and training as the presentation says. So my name is Andrei Frank. I joined recently the Lifelong Learning platform as a policy and advocacy coordinator. I was very keen on being here to talk to you, to see the common trends on investment across the different continents. It's been a bit disappointing to see that the trends are very much the same in terms of this neoliberalization and marketization of education. But just to give a quick context on our platform and answer the first question of the added value, we represent the European civil societies working in education and training. And as Ettore was mentioning, we do this from a cradle to grave perspective because we focus on lifelong learning to facilitate then European-wide cross-sector cooperation among these different organizations working at different levels of education and different types of education, informal, non-formal, or formal. We represent 42 networks, European networks, and they in themselves, they represent 50,000 education and training institutions. And more relevant for the topic of today, some of our members are the European Students' Union, the European Association for Higher Education Institutions, the EUCA, which is focusing on excellence in student halls, the Erasmus Student Network, the Mediterranean Universities Union, and this is just to mention a few of our members. So basically, then the added value comes from all the synergies between these different learning providers and the support that they can offer in breaking silos in education, because any issue at one point in the lifelong learning path has then implication on all the other steps and stages in one's education. So of course, our focus is broader than just investment, but investment is always interwoven. It's part of how education and training is being delivered. So it's very much interwoven in all of the aspects of our work. And it became even more front and center this year for a reason that'll become clear later on in my presentation. But just to offer a quick context on Europe also, there's been a decrease in the past years of public investment in education and training. So the LLP ran a research covering the last 2 decades, and it's very much clear that public investment is still below the 2008 levels after the crisis and after the austerity measures that have been implemented. So if we're talking back then of a 5.4% of the GDP on average being invested from EU member states in education training, now we're looking at 4.5 to 4.6%. There was an unusual spike in 2020 getting to 5%, but with more of a discrepancy across member states. Some of them actually investing less than 4% of their GDP. And here we're also just talking about member states. If you go outside of the EU and the European Union, then it's even lower levels of investment in education and training. For higher education specifically, 0.8% of the GDP on average was then invested across the EU, but at a time where more and more learners have been joining higher education. So then to compensate these growing needs, but also the decreased level of funding, public-private partnerships have been promoted by the EU, which don't in themselves necessarily mean something bad, but if you do so without sufficient indicators on frameworks on how these should be regulated, then you end up having some of the issues that Ellen then was talking about and then Falit was mentioning. So in this sense, then the impact that this has had on higher education in Europe has been significant. There's been an increase in student to teacher ratios, which then decreases the quality of learning, but also the attractiveness of the profession because of how complicated it becomes for teachers to operate in this context. And then the attractiveness also has been very much impacted, as Ellen was pointing out, the research from EI on the precarization of the profession there, the changes in their contracts, the constant need for research to ensure tenure, in a way that lowers the quality of the research. At the same time, it's been more managerial and more business-like styles of managing the higher education and excluding other groups from contributing to the way forward and ensuring inclusive and quality education for all of the learners participating. And then, of course, this all that did was to usher a performance-based funding system, which is usually linked in Europe with the attainment number of students attaining higher education. And then, of course, this leads institutions to lower some of their standards so that they can then make sure that learners can reach these targets, but then this means delivering a lower quality of education. It could also mean excluding those disadvantaged learners from higher education, because research shows that they are the ones underperforming due to their missing conditions to support them in their learning path. So then it's just a model that encourages an inequitable education system, basically. And more than all of this is the fact that such a system reinforces negative feedback loops. If those underperforming are the ones most in need of funding, by cutting their funding due to the underperformance seems very much illogical and just shocking. So then to compensate for all of this, the EU, and then of course to compensate for the aftermath of the COVID-19 pandemic, the EU pushed forward the Next Generation EU funding program, which is an 800 billion euros package. But the question that I received was like, what was the lessons learned from this, and how this can help? And I'm maybe worried that some of the lessons that were learned were not actually implemented over here, because there's been a lot of talk about building back better Europe after the pandemic, but it feels very much business as usual as these funding programs have passed through. So the way this package works is that each country develops a national recovery and resilience plan, which then details how the country aims to be more resilient, more sustainable, capable to address long overdue reforms. And then based on this, funding is dispersed. And the LLLP, together with its member, the European Students' Union, has engaged in strong advocacy to make sure that 10% of each country's plans is invested in education and training. The European Parliament has taken on these demands and have pushed for them. And as of right now, we are on average speaking of a 10% of the funding dispersed in this way being allocated to education and training. But this is not quite what we asked for, because it's not in each member state. So again, creating different tracks in Europe, different issues of inequity over here, with some member states really not getting close to this 10% benchmark that is very much needed. And beyond of this, most of the reforms are not quite the types of reforms that we were looking into, we were hoping for. Why? Because civil society, social partners, and other education stakeholders, which would have been legally required to participate into the development of these plans, have not necessarily been included by the member states. So then this has led to reforms that did not account for the needs of those impacted by them, students, teachers, but also by the needs of those that have expertise on the ground and have been working in this field and realize what is missing, what is needed. So then, to this end, the LLLP will continue advocating the monetization of the plans and how the rest of the disbursement of the funds will proceed. And in doing so, it has established as its annual theme for this year, investment in education and training. And this is why this has become front and center this year in our work, because this would be basically mainstreamed through all of the actions that we do. An annual campaign on this, an annual position paper, which is currently in development, as well as the focus of our annual flagship event, the Lifelong Learning Week, which starts on the 28th of November. And moving then to the campaign, which is the one in full steam right now. It's not dedicated only to higher education. It talks about investment in education in general, because the marketization and commodification of education has been occurring at all stages in the learning journey right now. But it still remains relevant for the students and for the higher education sector, considering how they're part of the campaign, but also considering, as I said, how one misstep at a point in the lifelong learning path can have implications later on for who joins higher education, for how you can join higher education, and so on. And the main goals of the campaign are then to urge EU member states to increase public investment in education and training. As Ellen was mentioning, domestic funding is the most important. Then, of course, to ensure that this investment is not done to transform the education into a tool for the labor market, but rather to promote education as a social good, as a good in itself, and as also something that focuses on the holistic development of all learners. At the same time, there's calls to ensure that education and training is inclusive, making sure that everybody has access to it and everybody can equitably receive quality education. And lastly, there is a discussion to reform the EU macroeconomic governance framework at EU level. So what this means for EU is that currently member states would be fined if they would run a budget deficit of 3%, higher than 3%, or they would accrue a national debt that is over 60% of their GDP. So this incentivizes member states then to cut education, to implement austerity programs and cut education as one of the first things. So then the LLP wishes to see that public investment in education would be excluded from the deficit and debts calculations, so that member states would be emboldened to invest in this rather than incentivized to cut from it. And we have a charter to accompany the Global Student Forum charter that I attached in the presentation over here. So you can, once ETERA circulates this, you can sign it and support the claims of the LLLP. So then in terms of the policies that could be changed, as this was a question that I received, it's clear that we need to change. There's a need for a cultural shift, a need to shift investment in education from this labor market mercantilistic view into investing in an inclusive and equity-based education system. And all of these are mentioned usually in EU funding programs or in EU targets, but it's always the balance tilts towards the labor market. Equity and inclusion are used very much as buzzwords because it's nice to have them in there. But the point here would be to tilt now the balance and actually take meaningful action towards investment for inclusion and equity, from an inclusion and equity-based perspective. And I think I'm running a bit out of my time, so I will let you with this and look forward to any questions that are coming from the audience. Thank you very much.
Really, really thank you, Andrei, and thank you all for this important and interesting contribution. Okay, we are running a little out of time, so in order also to gather all this kind of inputs and feedbacks, for sure, the organizing committee of the summit will have the possibility to collect all this kind of inputs, but for sure our partnership between us has to be pushed up a little bit in terms of supporting an international campaign for advocating for long-term economic planning, specifically in funding tools for education. I would like to ask you, if possible, in 30-40 seconds to try to reply, to answer to one specific point, because lots of you proposed interesting topics that are cross-sectoral and above all cross-national. And this is the most interesting aspect in this kind of campaigns. One last point has been left and has been tackled also by the GEM report, the Global Education Monitoring Report. It's also highlighted by Ellen, by Falit, and also by lots of colleagues, the balance between public and private funding tools. It's a great topic. And lots of you talked about privatization, commodification process, and as said by Andrei, we have a transnational path in a certain sense. So what is your point of view concerning the possible balance of these funding tools between public and private in particular? No more than 40 seconds, please, because the time is running out and the summit is proceeding with other interesting and fascinating live panels. With the same order, Ellen? Ellen and then Falit.
Fantastic. I think just grounding it based in the statements of before, that you need to have a democratic structure in order to be able to engage with this, whether that's engaging with students, whether that's engaging with teachers or civil society actors. The one running theme that we can see between us all is that democracy is essential to be built into domestic-based decision-making on educational funding. Until that is done, we are not fully free.
Falit?
Yeah, okay, so I just wrap it around. The point is that I believe that the private institutions cannot take care or do the work that the public institutions do, and specifically in terms of developing countries, there's a strong need to build very efficient and strong public institutions which are able to take care of all the needs. And second, the private institutions cannot be allowed to run amok and charge any amount of money. You need to have restrictions, subsidies, and a democratic structure imposed by the government upon these private institutions to ensure that they are accessible to everybody and subsidize all the needs. You cannot have blatant capitalization of education. Thank you.
Thank you, Falit. Punza, then Andrei.
When we talk about inclusive and equitable education, it's at the heart of ensuring that education is accessible, and privatization of higher institutions would not be the way. Another issue with privatization of education is that the resources in terms of digital learning and e-learning, where you find that private educations are able, or private players are able to participate with these gadgets and technologies, while people in public education cannot access these things. So private education, we need to ensure that we do not follow what the health has experienced, where in the health department, we find that government spends more on medical aids or subsidizing the health privately, while there is a decline in the health departments in public, and education should not follow that suit. Thank you.
Thank you, Punza. Andrei.
Thank you. Indeed, it's a different context for all of the countries, for all of the people, for all of the groups, and I think it's very important to respect very much this context, because what means private in one context is completely different from another. That being said, everybody should have a voice in how they are being impacted by learning. So this democratization aspect that we've discussed about, this is key, and we cannot allow privatization for the sake of the interest of the private sector, but rather for it to support this inclusion and equity perspective in education. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrei. Equality, democratization, and by the way, possibility of having a high and inclusive, accountable, transparent path concerning the development of these funding tools. Dear colleagues, it has been a great pleasure to meet you, and I'm sure that this kind of joint struggle will go on. Thank you for your contribution. Thank you to the organizing committee. Thank you, Sophia. Thank you for your organization, for your day-to-day incredible work, and up to the People's Global Summit, for the next live panel.